Late May 1885. Josephine Hartness pulled a handcart down the dirt road outside Ellis, Kansas, one wheel creaking with every turn. Ruth, 7, walked beside her, fist knotted in her mother's skirt. Eli, 12, pushed from behind the cart and hadn't spoken in over an hour. 3 ranches had turned her away in 2 days. The answer was nearly the same each time. They needed a man who could ride, mend wire, push cattle. Nobody needed a widow trailing 2 children. The 4th ranch appeared past a bend, a low log house, a horse shed, and a stretch of freshly turned ground that stopped halfway across the field, the furrows breaking off as if the man behind the plow had simply quit. Near the gate, an older man fought a harness one-handed, his other arm hanging loose at his side. Joe stopped the cart and asked for work. A woman stepped out from the porch, looked her over, then looked at the 2 children. "We're not hiring," she said. Not unkind, just final. Joe nodded and turned the cart around. She knew the answer by heart already. That was when she felt what was happening to Ruth before she saw it. The girl had stopped complaining about the heat 10 minutes back. Her lips gone dry, no sweat left on her forehead. Joe knew enough to know that the silence was worse than the whining had been. She pulled her daughter into the cart's shade, laid her back, and poured the last of the water from the canteen over the back of her neck. The woman on the porch had been watching them since she turned away. She was already moving before Joe went to her knees. Water came first, then cornbread, salt pork. The man stood over the 3 of them without a word, his eyes settling on the half-plowed ground behind him, then on the boy helping his mother sit up. The woman turned to her husband. She said nothing, just a look. He looked back at her, then at Joe. "What can you do?" Joe held his eyes. "I can milk. I can keep a garden. I've cooked for 6 people over an open fire and never wasted a pound of flour doing it. I can plow if the horse knows the work already." She paused. "I've never worked ground this dry. I won't tell you I have." The man studied her a moment longer than the answer needed. Something in his face eased, though his mouth didn't move. "Amos Witcom," he said finally. "This is my wife, Dell." Dell was already crouched beside Ruth, feeling the girl's forehead with the back of her hand. "She'll keep, once she's had more water than that." She looked up at Joe. "You did right, getting her out of the sun before she went down. Most people wait till they're already on the ground." Amos looked past Joe toward the half-plowed field, then back at her, then at the boy. "We're not hiring," he said. "Told you that already." He let the words sit before he went on. "But I've got more ground than the 2 of us can work, and less arm than I used to have." He lifted the hand that hung at his side. It didn't close all the way. "I've got land going to waste. You've got a back that still bends." Dell didn't look away from Ruth, but Joe saw her listening. "Here's what I can offer," Amos said. "Morning stock and 2 afternoons a week. That's mine. The rest of your daylight on that ground back there is yours. I'll give you the horse, the plow, the seed to start. Whatever you raise on it, we split it half, once the seed's paid back out of the crop." He nodded toward the low building near the barn. "There's a shed, not much, but it's got a roof that doesn't leak. Your boy looks like he can swing a hammer." Eli straightened at that, like the words had reached inside him and pulled something upright. Joe looked at the field, the shed, the 2 old faces waiting on her answer. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't quite work for wages either. It was something narrower than both, and she understood that better than either of them expected her to. "I'll take it," she said. Amos nodded once, like the matter was already behind him. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late the first night. Won't matter after that, but it matters tonight." By the time the sun dropped low, Eli had already found the loose floorboard in the shed's corner, the one that gave when he stepped on it. He didn't ask anyone. He just found a nail in the pail Amos had left by the door and drove it in himself, 3 solid strikes, while his mother swept out 20 years of dust with a broom borrowed from the porch. It was the first nail Eli drove at Witcom's ground. It would not be the last. The next weeks settled into a shape. Joe was up before light to milk alongside Dell, the two of them working in silence, broken only by the rhythm of hands against the pail, the barn still holding the night's cool air, dust turning slow in the first thin bar of sun through the door. After, she walked the half-mile out to whatever ground Amos needed that morning, mending stock fence, moving cattle to fresh grass, the chores that belonged to him by the terms they'd struck. By noon, her dress was stiff with dried sweat and chaff, and there was always more to do before supper. It was on one of those mornings, mealing in a furrow with Amos, that he first showed her how to read the dirt. He took a handful from low in the row, worked it between his fingers, let it fall. "Crumbles like that, it'll hold a crop," he said. "Sticks together in a hard ball, that's clay. And clay out here bakes shut by July." He nodded toward the slope beyond the fence line, the ground he'd offered her. "That ground there won't take wheat. Too thin on top, and it tips too hard toward the sun. I tried it my first year here. Lost the seed and near lost the horse pulling a plow through rock that shouldn't have been that close to the surface." Joe turned a clod over in her own hand, watched it break along a seam, held the pieces up to the light like she was reading something written in them. "I've seen sorghum grown on ground like that, back east of here, before." She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Amos considered this longer than she expected, long enough that a meadowlark finished its call somewhere behind them before he spoke again. "Growing, it's the easy part," he said finally. "Cutting it, milling it, boiling it down without scorching the pan, that's a different animal. Takes a hand that's done it before." He looked at her, not unkindly, but plainly. "Have you?" "No," Joe said, "but I've watched it done. Twice. Once from close enough to smell when it went wrong." He didn't answer that directly. He only nodded toward the shed where the old mill sat under a tarp and said nothing further about it that day. But that evening, walking back to the house, he slowed near the shed door long enough to lift a corner of the tarp and look under it, the way a man checks on something he'd forgotten he still owned. While Joe worked the fields, Ruth found her way into Dell's mornings without being asked. The first few days, Dell showed her how to walk the coop at first light and again before supper, how to feel for a cracked shell before it went in the basket, how to leave the nest boxes cool and dark so the hens would keep laying steady through the heat. There was a trick Dell had, holding an egg up close to a candle flame in the evening to see the shadow of what was inside. She never called it anything, never explained the why of it, just did it, and let Ruth watch until the girl started reaching for the candle herself. The first time Ruth held an egg up wrong, tilting it so the light caught nothing at all, Dell didn't correct her hand. She only turned her own egg the right way and let Ruth watch the difference. By the second week, Ruth was out at the coop before anyone called her, standing at the door with the basket already in hand, waiting for Dell to come out and find her there. Dell started leaving a second cup of coffee on the porch rail some mornings, small enough that nobody remarked on it, and Ruth never mentioned that she'd noticed. Eli's education ran alongside his mother's, out at the fence lines with Amos. Wire had to be strung with the right give in it. Too tight, and it would snap when the cold came and the posts shifted. Too loose, and a calf could push clean through. Amos showed him with his hands first, pulling the stretcher taut and letting Eli feel the resistance in the wire before he was allowed to try it himself. Eli's first stretch came out uneven, sagging in the middle where he'd misjudged the tension. He looked at it a long moment, jaw tight, waiting for Amos to say something about it. Amos said nothing about the mistake itself. He just picked up the stretcher and worked beside the boy to redo it, showing him with his hands, instead of his words, where it had gone wrong, the two of them quiet except for the creak of the wire drawing tight. When it held even down the line, Amos only grunted and moved to the next post. And Eli understood that was as close to praise as the man gave out. Joe broke the sorghum ground on 3/4 of an acre, the slope Amos had called worthless for wheat. He lent her the horse and the plow without being asked twice, and gave her seed out of his own bin, a debt she understood would come out of whatever the crop brought in come fall, same as the terms they'd shaken hands on. The ground fought her the first day, the plow catching on buried rock twice before noon, and by evening her palms had raised 2 blisters that Dell looked at without comment, and wrapped in strips of clean cloth soaked in liniment. It was Dell who brought out the pan. She pulled it from the back of the spring house one evening, wiping the dust off with the corner of her apron. A shallow iron basin, wide as a wagon wheel, one edge patched where it had cracked and been mended long before. The patch itself gone dark with age, the same as the rest of the iron. "This belonged to Amos's mother," Dell said, setting it down on the porch boards with a sound like a bell struck once and stopped. "Nobody's put a fire under it since she passed." She looked at it a moment, then at Joe. "It'll want cleaning before it earns its keep again, same as most things around here did, before you came up that road." Joe ran her thumb along the patched seam and said nothing. She didn't need to. Behind her, through the kitchen window, she could hear Ruth telling Dell about an egg she'd found that morning, already speaking of the coop as though it were partly hers. July came in dry, and stayed that way. The well dropped a hand's width every week, and the sky held that flat white color that meant no rain was coming soon. The cattle stood bunched in whatever shade the barn threw, tails working against flies that seemed thicker for the heat, and even the chickens quit scratching in the yard by mid-morning, folding themselves into the dust under the porch instead. Amos walked the sorghum rows with Joe after a rare shower one evening, the ground still dark and soft underfoot, the smell of wet dust rising thick around their boots. "Rain makes a crust," he said, breaking the surface with the side of his boot, showing her the pale, dry skin already forming over the wet dirt beneath. "Break it shallow before the sun takes the water back out of it." He handed her a hoe. "Do it the morning after every rain we get. Don't wait." She did, for 2 weeks straight, out before the heat rose, working the crust loose, row by row, the handle raising a blister of its own inside the one already healing on her palm. Ruth brought water out to her some mornings without being asked, walking careful with the bucket so as not to spill it, and stood at the end of the row watching until Joe waved her back toward the house. Then Brindle, the older of the 2 milk cows, went down hard with a calf turned wrong in the night. Amos came to the shed door before light and didn't have to say much. Joe was already pulling her boots on, the lamp still guttering low from being lit too fast. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Amos's bad hand no good for the reaching, but steady enough to hold the cow's head while Joe did what her own hands could manage. And by the time the calf was on its feet and nursing, the sun was past its highest point and the ground on the slope hadn't been touched in 3 days. She went out that evening anyway, too late to matter. The crust had set hard, cracked and gray, webbed through like the bottom of a dry creek bed, and the rows nearest the fence line, the last ones she'd have reached had there been time, showed it plainest. The stalks there stood shorter than the rest, leaves curling tight against the heat instead of standing open to catch what little there was of it. She stood at the edge of that stretch a long moment, turning a handful of the cracked dirt over and letting it fall through her fingers the way Amos had shown her, then went back to the house without a word about it. Dell noticed her stripping burdock off the wagon wheel that night longer than the job required, working the same spot over and over with her thumbnail. "Some ground pays for the day you didn't get to it," Dell said, not looking up from her own mending. "Most farmers around here have a stretch like that somewhere on their place. Yours just happens to be new enough that you can point to exactly which day did it." That same week, the well dropped low enough that Amos put the family on a stricter count for washing water, and Eli took to hauling extra from the creek bed a half-mile off, where a trickle still ran between stones gone white with dryness elsewhere. Ruth went with him twice, carrying the smaller bucket, and came back the second time with her dress hem soaked where she'd waded in past what she should have. Joe saw it and said nothing beyond handing her a dry apron, understanding well enough what it cost a child to find one cool thing in a month like that one. Saturday, Dell took her along to town to sell butter, the wagon jolting over ruts baked hard by weeks without rain. The buyer at the mercantile turned the crock over in his hands, pressed a thumb into it, and set it back down without much ceremony. "Last week yours held," he said. "This week there's water in it." Dell didn't argue the point, only nodded once and took the crock back. On the ride home, she showed Joe what she meant, working the buttermilk fully out of the print before it went to market, pressing it firm in the mold instead of leaving it soft, salting it even through so it wouldn't weep in the crock by midweek. Joe worked the next batch herself under Dell's eye that evening, wrists aching by the time it was done, the cool of the spring house a relief after a day spent mostly in the sun. It was at the mercantile, waiting on flour, that Joe first heard the talk. Two women near the dry goods didn't lower their voices as much as they thought they had. Something about old Witcom handing his ground over to a stranger woman off the road, giving away for nothing what he'd spent 30 years building. Joe kept her eyes on the counter and her hands steady on the flour sack and said nothing, though the words sat in her chest the whole ride home. She wasn't the one who answered it. Amos was at the feed store 2 doors down when a man asked him straight out what he was paying the widow to work his land. Amos didn't raise his voice. "I'm not paying her anything," he said. "She works my ground mornings and 2 afternoons, same as I told anybody who asked before you did. What she raises on the rest of it, we split even, once the seed's paid back. That's the whole of it." He hefted his sack of feed onto his shoulder. Ground was sitting empty before she came. It isn't now. He walked out without waiting to see if the answer had satisfied anyone standing there. By the time Joe heard about it, secondhand, from Dell on the ride home, it had already done what it needed to do. Nobody asked again, not out loud, though she caught a few longer looks than usual the next time she was in town. The dry spell broke finally in the last week of July. Not with rain, but with a morning cool enough to work in without the sun flattening everything by 9. Joe walked out to check the fence line at the eastern edge of the pasture and found Eli already there, alone, splicing a break in the wire without having been asked. He'd set the tension right on his own, the way Amos had shown him weeks before, testing it with his palm, the same way she'd seen the old man do a dozen times. And it held, clean and even down the line. Amos came up behind her without a word, looked the repair over end to end, ran his good hand along the wire once, and nodded before walking on toward the barn. He didn't tell the boy it was good work. He didn't have to. Eli straightened a little as the old man passed and went back to coiling the spare wire like it was nothing at all. The last week of September, Amos and Eli pulled the horse mill out from under its tarp in the corner of the shed. Rust had crept along the rollers where damp had gotten in over the years, and Amos worked at it with an oiled rag, while Eli held the lantern close, asking what each part did before Amos had finished explaining the last one. One of the wooden gears had split along an old crack. Amos found a length of seasoned oak in the rafters, and the two of them shaped a new one together at the bench, filing the teeth by hand until it turned true against its neighbor, sawdust curling onto the dirt floor between them. Joe and Dell scrubbed the syrup pan with sand and water until the iron showed clean underneath the old scorch marks, working in circles with rags wrapped around their hands, and Dell raked the ash out from under the furnace stones, checking the brick for cracks that might let the fire breathe wrong once it was going. By the time they finished, the pan sat gleaming dull silver in the afternoon light, and Dell ran her palm flat across the bottom of it like she was checking for a fever. 20 years is a long nap for a mill, Amos said, wiping his hands on a rag already black with grease. Wakes up slow if you don't help it along. 2 days later, he walked the sorghum rows with Joe, the stalk standing taller than both of them now, heavy heads bowing at the top. He pulled one toward him and pinched a kernel between his thumbnail and finger, working it slowly, feeling for something Joe couldn't yet name. The milkiness that ran out when he'd tried it a week before was gone now. What remained was soft and gave under the pressure like dough. "Now," he said, "before it hardens." He passed the stalk to her, and she pinched a kernel of her own between thumbnail and finger, feeling for what he'd felt, the give of it, no milk left to run. He looked past her toward the horizon, where a gray line had been building low against the sky for 2 mornings running. Weather's turning. We'll want to move. Joe wanted to cut it all in one push. She said as much, nodding toward the clouds, but Amos stopped her at the edge of the first row before she'd finished the thought. "Don't cut what we can't mill," he said. "Juice sours in the stock if it sits past a day, maybe 2 if we're lucky, and sour juice makes sour syrup, no matter how careful you boil it after. Cut what we can press and boil before dark, and no more than that." He handed her a knife. "We'll take the rest tomorrow, whether or no." They took roughly half that day. Joe and Eli worked down the rows with the knives, cutting the heavy stalks and stripping the leaves in the same motion Amos had shown them, the cut stalks piling up faster than either had expected. Amos fed them into the mill one at a time, the horse walking its slow circle around the post, green juice running down the trough into the catch barrel below, the smell of it sharp and grassy in a way none of them had words for. By evening, the pan was on the fire, set up under the lean-to roof of the old syrup shed, and the 4 of them took turns at the skimming ladle while the juice reduced, the sweet, heavy smell of it settling into the yard and drawing Ruth out from the house to sit close enough to watch without being told to help. That first batch came off clean past midnight, poured into jars still warm enough to fog in the cool night air, and nobody stayed up past the pouring. The second day brought the other half of the crop down under a sky that had gone the color of an old bruise by afternoon. They cut faster than the day before, Eli's hands blistering where the knife handle rubbed against a spot the first day hadn't touched. Joe working 2 rows over from him without either of them speaking much, both listening for the first roll of thunder that never quite came. The mill turned steady through it all, the horse patient in its circle, the trough running green again until the barrel stood full and the last of the stripped stalks lay in a pale heap at the edge of the field. By full dark, the pan was on again. This time, the tiredness of 2 long days sat heavier on all of them than either had noticed while the work itself was still moving. Del took the first watch at the ladle, skimming the pale foam that rose and thickened as the juice cooked down, calling out the color changes to Amos the way she'd learned to years before he'd stopped needing to be told. Joe took over near midnight, when Del's eyes had gone glassy with sleep she wouldn't admit to needing, and stood alone over the pan in the low firelight, the steam rising warm against her face, her own eyes burning from 2 nights with almost no rest between them. She skimmed steady for a while, then steadier, the rhythm of it almost gentle, the fire's low crackle and the pan's slow simmer folding together into something close to peaceful. Then her attention slipped, not all at once, but by degrees, the ladle slowing in her hand, her eyes closing for the length of one breath, then staying closed a moment longer than that. It was only a few seconds. It was long enough. The corner of the pan nearest the firebox, where the iron ran hottest and the syrup sat shallowest, went past syrup into something darker. Del smelled it before anyone saw it, a burnt edge under the sweetness that hadn't been there a minute before, sharp enough to cut through sleep. She was up from where she'd been resting and at the pan in 3 steps, pulling burning wood out from under the firebox with a pair of tongs, shouting for Joe before she'd even fully understood why. Joe woke fully to the smell a half-second behind her, already reaching for the ladle, her heart going hard in her chest before her mind had caught up to what her body already knew. Together they pulled the fire down and dragged the pan half off the heat, the 2 of them working without speaking, Amos stumbling out from the house in his shirt sleeves at the sound of Del's voice, Eli right behind him still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Del dipped a finger into what remained and touched it to her tongue, then shook her head once, sharp. There was no saving a scorched batch by picking around the burnt part. The taste worked itself through the whole pan once it took hold, sweet and bitter gone in too deep to separate. The batch went to the hog trough whole, all of it, no jar of it kept back to stretch the count. Between the 2 nights, they'd drawn 57 gallons of syrup off the cane. 8 of it went to the hogs. 49 stood good. Nobody said much about it that night. Jo carried the spoiled portion out to the hog trough herself before she went to bed, walking it across the dark yard alone, and didn't offer any excuse for it on the way back, though Amos was standing on the porch when she returned, and neither of them spoke. Morning brought a full count. 49 gallons stood in jugs and jars, crowding the pantry shelves and the floor beneath them, capped and cooling, catching the early light in a long amber row, less than the ground might have given on a better year, on ground that hadn't lost 3 days to a sick cow in July, worked by hands new enough to lose a night's batch to tired eyes. Jo wrote the number down on a scrap of paper in the same plain hand she used for everything else, and didn't dress it up as anything more than what it was. Amos came in while she was still writing, looked over the rows of jugs without touching any of them, and counted under his breath the way he might count cattle at a gate. He stood there a long moment, long enough that Jo half expected him to say something about the lost 8 gallons. "First year's like that," he said instead, ground still deciding if it likes you. He nodded once, toward the jars, toward her. "This'll do." The first frost came early in October, silvering the grass along the fence line before sunrise, and gone by the time anyone was up to see it properly except Dell, who noticed such things out of habit. 2 days before, the buyer at the mercantile had taken 47 gallons off the wagon at 45 cents on the gallon. The last 2 jugs held back, at Dell's insistence, for the pantry, where a house needed at least that much sweetening to get through a winter. That evening, with the coins from town still wrapped in a cloth in the tin box, Amos brought the account book to the kitchen table and set it down between the lamp and the bread. He opened it to a page already marked with a strip of cloth. "Sorghum seed," the entry read. The sum for what Jo had taken in May, written small and plain in Amos's hand. He turned the book so she could read it herself. 47 gallons sold, he said. Comes to a little over $21, gross. He worked the sum with a stub of pencil, slow and careful, the way a man does figures he doesn't trust himself to rush. Take the seed back out of that, he tapped the earlier entry. Leaves close to 20, splits down to about $10 apiece once we have it. Jo looked at the number a long moment. It wasn't nothing. It also wasn't much, set against a whole season of blistered palms and 1 lost night's batch poured out to the hogs. Amos counted the coins out twice before he pushed them across the table toward her, like a man double-checking work he already knew was right. "Not enough for the heifer," he said. "No," Jo agreed. She folded the coins into a scrap of cloth and tied it off, the small weight of it settling into her palm. "But it's more than I had in May." Amos didn't answer that directly. He closed the account book and set it back on the shelf where it lived, between a Bible gone soft at the corners and a tin of nails, and said nothing further about money that night. It was Dell, later, drying the last of the supper plates, who brought up what came next. "Ground you broke this year'll be easier next," she said, not looking up from the plate in her hands. "Won't fight you near as hard the second time through. Amos will tell you the same, once he's ready to talk about it." "When's he ready to talk about it?" Dell smiled, small and dry. "When the ground's cold enough that talking about next spring doesn't feel like tempting something." Nothing more was settled that night, and nothing needed to be. The shape of it sat between them anyway. More acres next year, maybe, if the well held and the weather turned kinder. The same arrangement, or something close to it, worked out slow the way most things at Witcom ground seem to get worked out, in their own time and not before. The syrup pan went back to the spring house a few days later, scrubbed clean of the last batch's residue, the scorched corners scoured pale again where the fire had run hottest. Dell carried it out herself, Jo following with a rag to wipe the shelf it would sit on through the winter. "Keep it in your shed instead," Dell said, setting it down not in its old spot, but at the door, waiting to be carried the other direction. "Springhouse is Amos's mother's place for it. Yours now, long as you're working this ground." She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "We'll need it again come next fall." Jo carried it to the shed herself that evening, set it on the shelf beside the 2 jugs kept back for winter, and didn't say anything about what it meant to have it sitting there, waiting on a season that hadn't started yet. The last warm afternoon of the year, Eli spent at the fence line without being asked, walking the full length of it alone with a coil of spare wire over his shoulder, checking every post and splice he and Amos had worked on since June. Amos found him out there near sundown, leaning against the top rail where the boy had stopped to rest, and stood beside him a while without either of them saying much, looking out over ground that had been half plowed and abandoned looking back in May, and now ran green and fenced clean to the tree line. "Held up all season," Eli said finally, more to the fence than to the man beside him. "Most of it did," Amos said. "That stretch by the creek'll want restringing before the snow. Wire stretches different in the cold than it does in July." He didn't say it like a criticism. He said it the way a man passes down something he expects to be remembered. Eli nodded, filing it away the same plain way he'd filed away everything else that summer, and the 2 of them stood there until the light went long and orange across the pasture, and it was time to head in for supper. Inside, Ruth had fallen asleep against Dell's side on the porch bench, worn out from an afternoon spent sorting the last of the season's eggs by size into 3 baskets, a single egg still cupped loose in her hand where sleep had caught her midsort. Dell didn't move to wake her. She sat still instead, one arm settled around the girl, without seeming to notice she'd put it there, watching the last of the light go down over the fence line where her husband and the boys still stood talking. Jo came up the porch steps quiet, meaning only to check on her daughter, and stopped instead at the sight of it. Ruth asleep against a woman who owed her nothing. An egg still held safe in one small fist. Out past the yard, her son standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who'd had no reason to teach him anything at all. Nobody had said much, all season, about what any of it meant. Nobody said much about it now, either. Winter would come soon enough, and with it the long stretch of months where the ground gave nothing back, and there was little to do but wait it out and see what the well held, and what the cattle needed, and whether the next crop, come spring, might run to a full acre instead of 3/4 of one. For now there was only the porch and the last of the light and a syrup pan sitting clean in a shed that had been empty in May and wasn't empty anymore.